Hi,
great to
Carol.
see you, man.
Thank you for
I
the
showed,
kind introduction.
yeah, I showed in my introduction because right now the floor is yours. If you could make introduction about the serverless days, because I think it all started somewhere because of you. So I think that you are the best person to present this whole event and what it's actually about for people who are for the first time with us.
Totally, will do. Thank you very much, Carol. Yeah, I'm a developer advocate, and I'm super happy to be here and introduce this conference. It's still online. I'm hoping that in the next few years I can join you guys in person, but it's still great to meet and share ideas. So let me see if I can share my screen real quick. Here we go. Awesome. So in this keynote, I would like to share with you, first of all, my personal experience with serverless. Like Carol said, I got introduced to this community back in 2016. So I'm super happy to share some of the some of the best practices, but first of all, some of the history, because I think it's important to see what happened, from 2014, back when AWS Lambda was created, in the last 7 years. It feels like it's not been 7 years. But now it is possible to have 5 or 6 years experience in serverless, believe it or not. And then I want to dive into this serverless mindset, meaning all those best practices and some of the myths and some of the patterns and anti-patterns that today allows you to build serverless applications in a practical, efficient, and secure way. So I hope that putting all of this together, you get a sense of where the community is and what we're doing, what AWS is doing as well, because I work at AWS, but before joining AWS, I was still an evangelist or an advocate in a startup, and I loved playing with all clouds. So I hope if you're here today, I do hope that you use AWS, but we're talking about serverless and function as a service and all of this technology, across all the clouds as well. I come from the startup world, but basically I'm a web developer. I'm a software engineer. I've been a customer of AWS since 2013, 2014. And again, I joined the serverless movement. I think the way it was called back then was kind of like the serverless revolution. And, a lot of these things start as a revolution just to attract some attention, but then it became real. And that is why I want to share with you some of the serverless history, why we're here today. And then we go into the community and into the patterns and so on. So I think a bit of information that is not as well known as many of us who've been in serverless for a while know, is that Lambda, which is the one service that kind of kicked off this whole movement or community. Lambda was not a compute service. Lambda was a service born in a storage world. Lambda was intended initially as a proof of concept, as a preview, and as the first iterations of the service to be part of S3, basically. I mean, to be part of the way that customers would use to process S3 objects, because the reality is that customers and developers and data scientists, whoever was using S3, it's super easy to store objects on S3. Even in from 2006 to 2014, a lot of people use S3. But the missing piece was about how do you process those hundreds or thousands or millions, sometimes even billions of events as soon as they are stored. So Lambda was born to solve that problem. Believe it or not, a lot of people don't know this, so I like to remind this, how sometimes big ideas or big services that have big impact are born for a totally different reason. Nobody at the time thought you could use Lambda or any function as a service functionality to build websites and to build machine learning or data pipeline, data processing applications. So I think that's funny to or interesting to look back and see how much has changed since 2014. And then I the first time I met serverless, let's say, I had one of those light bulb moments. When you realize that you can start doing things differently. Back then, I was leading a data science team in the startup I was working at, and basically we were hiring data scientists and machine learning experts, and we needed a way to deploy all these machine learning models. But as a data science team, we were not super expert of operations and cluster management and configuration, like all this infrastructural knowledge that you need to operate a large-scale cluster and so on. So when I first heard of serverless, I thought, hey, I can use this for my team to make them faster, to make them more independent, to make sure they can operate and deploy and manage all these services, without depending on someone else, like on an operations team or a DevOps team, if there is any such thing as a DevOps team. Anyways, I think that today that light bulb moment probably looks different for many of you. There is a lot more features, a lot more services and integration. So it's probably even more fun. But I still hope that during the day, if you haven't worked with serverless, yeah, you get the same type of light bulb moment. The community has changed, the technology has changed. So let's have a look at what happened from 2014 until the last few years, to see how that evolved and how quickly it became something that is used by thousands and thousands of organizations. Last time I checked, 9 out of the 10 largest AWS customers worldwide were already using serverless, and this is back to already a couple of years ago. So it is used a lot out there, if you haven't heard about these numbers yet. So again, Lambda came out in 2014, and that was a preview. It took a few months to become generally available, and it supported mainly S3 and a couple more services. Then API Gateway came up, and that was July 2015. So it was already 6-7 months later, and that opened the mind of a lot of people who finally realized, hey, we can actually build web applications and APIs and RESTful services and all kind of things with this Lambda service. And then, for example, in October 2015, I don't know how many of you know the serverless framework today. Back then it was called JAWS. It came up in October 2015, and it totally changed the developer experience. Back then it was still pretty hard to, as a developer, to integrate your app or to deploy easily. There was no, deployment workflow that would work locally, and we'll talk about all these patterns later. But basically, that is when a lot of people started looking at serverless in a real way. Like I can use this stuff in production, and JAWS was in preview for a few months, and that is when I met serverless. That was December 2015, between December and January, and in a matter of few weeks, my team could take the technology. I built something using the serverless framework, and I built something else doing my own script. Like how do you deploy, how you zip your deployment package, how do you do all the things that today are super easy, but back then it took me a good amount of days to figure those things out. Also because we needed to deploy machine learning models, so I had to find a way to stick those models into the deployment package, and I have hundreds of megabytes and I couldn't do it. So there were a few challenges. There were you did not have 10 gigabytes of RAM. You did not have all the functionalities and integrations that you have today. So it was simpler, I would say, but still, we had challenges and we had to solve them. And but what mattered for me and for the company is that in a matter of a few weeks, we had something that worked, something that we could bring to production. And my team was independent. They could build new machine learning models with a couple of scripts, because there was nothing better than that. They could deploy it to production, and operate those services, because it was much easier for a data scientist to operate, or for a developer for that matter, to operate a Lambda function than to operate a fleet of virtual machines across multiple availability zones and security groups and so on. So the CTO was happy about this. My team was not slowing down other teams. We were independent. We were developing and deploying to production very fast. What happened then? Well, communities and events started popping up. I went to Serverless Conf New York in May, and I was super lucky to have the opportunity to speak at Serverless Conf Tokyo later that year. That was one of the best experiences of my life, visiting Japan as well, meeting a lot of great people. Fast forward a few months, Jeff Conf was born, and Jeff Conf was hosted in a few cities, in London, then in Milan. I organized one, and in Hamburg in Germany. And the goal was kind of transitioning towards hosting events that would be inclusive, so that you didn't have to travel all the way to New York City or London or Tokyo to attend one. But we wanted to have as many as possible in as many cities as possible. And this led the way to Serverless Days. If you fast forward another few months, in April 2018, that's when Serverless Days were born. And there was a rebranding that was needed, just to clarify what the hell is Jeff, why Jeff Conf. There was a bit of hard to explain, but this really helped the community to host more than 45 events in the last 3 years, just to give you the scale of how that evolved quickly. And that's also why we are here today. This is Serverless Days Warsaw, and this is why we ended up here. Of course, a lot more happened during 2017 and then 2018. Here I focused on the community, but new services came up like AWS Step Functions, and there were a lot more serverless comms and other Jeff comms, and other function as a service providers popped up, like the Google Cloud Functions in beta for a while, and the Azure Functions, the second version I think, in September 2018. So a lot of other vendors started popping out a few years after AWS, and there were a lot of contributors. I can think of Tim Wagner, the person who invented Lambda, and Austin Collins, the author of the Serverless framework, and the guys from A Cloud Guru, and Anne Stanley, who kicked off Jeff Conf in London with guys like Paul Johnston, for example, and also Simon Wardley, for example, who is into Wardley mapping. I'll share with you a link later if you're interested in mapping. And just to give you a look at what the Serverless Days community look today, there are, I think, more than 40 organizing teams around the world, and like we said earlier, I'm trying to help many of them organize more events in more cities, so that it's easier for a lot of people who cannot or do not want to travel to attend these events. And I hope it keeps growing as well. So let's talk a little bit about this serverless mindset. I think from a personal point of view, maybe it's different for other people, but coming from a development, software engineering background, I remember that I had to embrace the idea that my job was not just writing code, but my job was solving business problems. And maybe for you, this is, of course, but for a lot of people that I meet, they are 100% focused on writing code, and everything needs to be code. And solving the business problem is kind of a side effect of what you're doing, but it's actually your main objective as a developer. And often what you need to solve the business problem is already out there. You can buy or you can consume it as a product or as a service. And this is a realization that a lot of people that come into the serverless world have to realize slowly, like you don't have to code and re-implement and reinvent everything. Some people, instead of serverless, call it serviceful, because you end up using a lot of services, and then you use function as a service as a glue between all these services. So rather than rebuilding all the tools in your toolbox you can just reuse or consume and use third-party or provider cloud services to solve those problems. In a way, I would also say that I had to transition towards becoming an architect, like a software architect, not just a coder, like a programmer. Similar to many best practices in the DevOps world, being a serverless developer also means that you own the service and the code and the functions and the applications that you build. So the code and the architectural design and the operations and the cost optimizations and everything around it. That is the real transition. So it's taking everything that came with DevOps and bringing it forward. It's not deleting everything that happened. Totally not. And in my experience, serverless makes that transition much easier. If you are a developer and you need to learn the last 20-25 years of operational best practices using virtual machines, that's a lot more work than doing the same with serverless. So that's why I got passionate. But what happened in reality is that when you start doing serverless, you actually do more operations, but we'll talk about it later. What I mean is that as a developer today, you're probably not doing operations on a daily basis. You mostly code. With serverless, you can start owning your services in a much easier way. But that means that you have to start doing something that maybe you were not doing yesterday. And you can do it because you have more time, because you're not writing as much code. But we can dive into this later. I think something super useful to remember is this shared responsibility model that AWS has, but a lot of other cloud providers have the same, where the responsibility of the cloud provider is everything, from the physical infrastructure to the virtual machines and the physical hosts, and depending on what you're building, it might extend up to the container environment and the virtualization and some of the automatic patching of the system and so on. Beyond that, it is your responsibility. So I think it's super useful to look at this from a graphical perspective. So imagine that we define a space where some things are managed by the cloud vendor, like AWS, for example, everything below this line, and other things are managed by you, so the builder, the developer, the customer. If we think about abstraction levels, we go from physical servers to virtual machines to containers to functions, and eventually there will be something else to add vertically. But let's see where serverless is and why it's important to think about the shared responsibility model, because it applies to security, but I think it applies to a lot more things. So if you think about EC2 and Lightsail and services that operate at the virtual machine layer, there are a few things that the service is doing for you, but if you look vertically, most of the things are your responsibility. The consumer space is pretty tall. If we move forward, you have containers. If you move forward, you have functions. Of course, there is something down there, bare metal, but this is very off topic today. And there are a few more things that came up recently, like UpRunner or Fargate, who are not as easy to put on this chart, because some of the things that you can do in Lambda, now you have Docker support for container-based deployment packages, and you have Fargate and UpRunner, where these two layers are slowly overlapping, let's say, to give you the best experience ever, to fit with your application and your culture and your processes as much as possible. But what is really important to see, if you think about the responsibility model, is that with Lambda and function as a service, the amount of things that you need to own is very small, is very short if you look vertically. The consumer space in that column is tiny, because the provider is taking care of all the container orchestration of the maintainment of operating system libraries, the virtual machines, and all the way down to physical bare metal machines and the physical security of the data centers and so on. So I think this abstraction difference makes your life as a developer a lot easier, and that's why you can own the code and the architecture and the apps that you're building without learning or relearning the last 25 years of operational best practices. Now, there are a few myths and patterns and anti-patterns that came up in the last few years. So I want to go through 5 or 6 of these. And today there is a great agenda, and I'm sure all the great speakers, today and tomorrow, all the great speakers will touch on many of these. With Jeremy and Danilo and Luca and Goiko and many of the other speakers can go really deep into some of these patterns and myths. I think the first one that I already anticipated is that serverless means no ops. Totally false. Like I anticipated, often if you come from a development background like I did, I actually started doing ops. So I did a lot more ops than before when I started doing serverless, because all of a sudden I was responsible and I was able to own the services and the applications that I was building. So that means monitoring. That means making sure that my application is secure. That means observability, building dashboards, and going and fixing problems when they come up. So don't think that going serverless makes all your operations disappear. There is still something that you need to take care of. The important part is, as a developer, you are totally capable of owning those parts instead of relying on other teams or other people who have a deeper operational background. But there are cases where you will need to learn something about operations if you haven't yet. And change happens, shift happens, so embrace the idea of extending the scope of your work, beyond just writing code. And if you are already doing that today, it will be much easier to do that in a serverless fashion. The second myth I want to talk about is the idea that lift and shift is awesome and it's also the finish line. Lift and shift means taking something that already works, that using a different technology, and just lifting it and shifting and throwing into a new box without touching it. Well, often it's a good starting point to prove that function as a service or serverless overall can provide you value to your team, to your organization, but it's almost never the finish line. So my suggestion is to start with a simple lift and shift on a project that you know very well, maybe a personal project, and I think this will help you validate and also remove some of the unknowns that how does the technology work, how does this work, and blah blah blah. But remember that many of the benefits, you actually realize them when you start building with a serverless mindset from scratch, or maybe slightly re-architecting or rethinking some parts of the application, using ad hoc frameworks, avoiding sticking to older conventions that maybe some of your full stack frameworks forced you to do in the last few years. For example, I like to start thinking when migrating a project or rebuilding or lifting and shifting a project, how much code I can remove from that project by delegating some of those functionalities to Lambda, to the function as a service functionalities and integration itself, or maybe to an external service. And as a developer, that's a bit counterintuitive, because if you think that your work is writing code, removing code doesn't feel like you're actually working. But in the end, if you also embed some operational mindset and some architect mindset, this totally makes sense. So embrace that idea a little bit more. The third myth is that local emulators will give you all the confidence that you need. And there are a lot of emulators that emulate cloud providers locally, databases and queues and authentication and some of the other things. In reality, even if you have it with the serverless framework, with AWS SAM, there are even projects like Local Stack that literally help you emulate a lot of services locally. I think it's an illusion. It's a false confidence, because many of these emulators do not implement things that actually matter in production. Things like security, performance, optimization, like authentication, or things like rate limiting and throttling and All those things that when you actually go into production environment, if those don't work, nothing works. So the idea that you can use a local emulator on your machine to make sure that everything works, you are raising your confidence only by a very, very little bit. Today, it's super easy to have a personal account, like in almost every cloud provider. So my suggestion is use unit tests locally, eventually with an emulator, but at a unit test level to make sure that the functionalities you're building actually run, but then build a lot of integration tests to make sure in a real cloud environment that everything works. Because at the end of the day, local emulators are not a substitute for integration tests. If that's what you are thinking, that is probably not going to help you, or you're going to waste a lot more time later on when it is time to integrate in a real pre-production or even production environment. The fourth myth is that serverless is only for web API, RESTful APIs, and so on. This is actually super easy to debunk because in my personal experience, I've started using serverless for machine learning applications. We embedded literally Python scikit-learn based applications in Lambda, and now it's even much easier to do because you have more memory, more power, more deployment package size, and so on. You even have support for elastic file system and things that really simplify that kind of workloads, but also analytics and also all kind of programming language that were not supported back in 2016 and 2017. Things like PHP or things like I've read articles about customers embedding COBOL code into AWS Lambda. So there are a lot of use cases where what you're building is not a web API or is not necessarily using Node.js or Java or all the default languages supported built in. And if you really are building a web API, not everything needs to be a synchronous call. So synchronous calls are great, and almost everything can be designed as a synchronous API, but keep in mind that there are many processes and many features that can be turned into asynchronous. And this allows you to decouple the client from the backend logic, for example, often either or both improving the user experience, increasing the resiliency of the backend, especially for those long-running tasks. If an API needs to run for 25 seconds, that is probably not the best way to do it. In AWS, you can trigger asynchronous functions super easily. When there is a new object on S3, when there is a new message on SQS or a new item in your DynamoDB database, and there are like 100 more. So always think if these alternatives can provide a better user experience to the person or the developer or the application that is invoking your API. But at the same time, it can increase the resiliency and even lower the costs of your solution. Because running a Lambda function for a couple of minutes, you can probably make that invocation cheaper if you use something else like step functions or some other event-driven invocation or integration. So think of different ways to implement something that maybe a couple of years ago or 5 or 10 years ago you would have implemented as a super simple web API. And the last myth I want to go through is that a lot of people I meet tell me that, okay, today I can have up to 10 gigabytes of RAM, but my workload, my function, my code doesn't need all that memory. Well, the reality in AWS Lambda, but in almost every function as a service offering, is that memory equals power. So if you give your functions more memory, you can achieve a lot more power. And power means CPU throughput, network throughput, everything goes faster because basically under the hood, it's a bigger, faster, better machine. And I'm super passionate about this topic, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I'll reference this project that I've been working on for the last few years that basically allows you to use a data-driven approach to power tune your function. So find the optimal trade-off between cost and performance and memory in your application on a function per function basis. just to conclude, I want to share with you some of the resources and interesting videos and newsletters and things that I monitor frequently to stay up to date. The first one is a great talk from 2017 by Simon Wardley. Maybe you have attended his sessions in the last few years, but Why the Fuss About Serverless is one of the best sessions that we have ever attended. Me personally, every time I learn something new, so maybe consider watching it a few times. And if you cannot take a screenshot, just search on Google, Why the Fuss About Serverless by Simon Wardley. There is a great website focused on AWS mostly, that is Serverless Land. So if you're curious about super deep dive articles and updates and news about serverless on AWS, check it out. And the last resource I want to share is the Off by None newsletter by Jeremy Daly, which is also the next speaker. So thank you Jeremy for your work on Off by None. And with that, I'm done. I think I'm a little bit over time, but I hoped I gave you some good references and a good refresh of the history of serverless and some of the milestones and achievements of the community.
Alex, excellent. Thank you very much for your session. And I think that people now understood how much time the community spent on serverless to bring it to the point we are right now. And I don't know if we got any questions on the chat. If not, I've got two, having you here. So I
Thank
don't
you
know
very much, Carl.
Appreciate it, guys. Have we got any questions? Because I don't see any. So maybe having the time. You, Alex, mentioned about the shifting the responsibility. So we've got those dev teams that got used to some, standards and some responsibility being on ops teams. And you mentioned something like changing that responsibility because you're taking those services in your team, you're doing the code, but you are a part of that service. How do you think? Is it a kind of blocker for development teams from your experience, or maybe not? Maybe they want such kind of, responsibility eventually.
I think it's I came from that exact situation, and for me it was a mix of kind of a trade-off between freedom and ownership. Like, I love to be more free and autonomous and able to do what I needed to do without waiting or polling other people in the team or in the organization. At the same time, I was a bit afraid of owning more because I wasn't used to monitoring dashboards and owning the deployment process and stuff like that. So I think the trade-off, the balance, is very well worth it. So don't be afraid of it. Again, embrace the idea of also, as a developer, as you transition from junior to senior and move forward with your career, it's very common that you transition from programmer to cloud to software architect. So that mindset also aligns to your career progression and your seniority level. So don't be afraid of that. It's quite normal that you think more in terms of architectural patterns and services instead of just how many lines of code did I write today. So to me, it was a very well investment, a very good investment.
So it's not also tightly related to your expertise, but also shifting your mindset. So because you are not only developing, putting the code, but you are, like you mentioned somewhere before, you're a software architect, either architect or developer. So you have to understand what's beneath your code.
Yeah,
Great.
that means architecture, but also means cost. I meet a lot of developers every day that if I ask them, how much is your application costing. They don't really know because they don't see the service in production. They don't know where their code is living and breathing and solving
Exactly.
problems. So I think getting closer to your code in production is a good investment of your time. So you understand it better, you can build better software and better code in the long term.
Okay, perfect. And my last question, because I was watching your session and thinking, because you mentioned about the history. So, how do you think? What kind of challenges are ahead of us regarding serverless niche? Because it's still a niche, but people are m- more carefully watching what's happening and what's ahead of us. So, how do you think about the future and challenges itself?
That's a good question. I think from a community standpoint, not considering the technology, we're still working a lot on awareness, and that's why we are here today. We want to make sure that people are more comfortable, people know what tooling exists. Also because it's changing so rapidly that, if you randomly stumbled upon serverless 3 or 4 years ago, you would probably think, hey, this thing is too new, the tooling is too immature, and it's not working for my development process or my team. And just fast forward 2 or 3 years later, and almost everything changed. So I think it's important to keep an eye on what's going on and what the vendors, but also what the community and the open source project are doing to simplify all of this. And I think there is a lot of work being done there. Of course, the development experience can be always better. There is no upper limit to how good a development experience can be, and a lot of people and developers and open source contributors and also the vendors are putting a lot of time on improving all of these things. So I'm hopeful that it's going to be easier, and you get more integrations, you get more performance, you get cheaper cost. And from an organization point of view, that means that if you have an application running today, in a year or two, if the traffic is the same, it's going to be faster and cheaper, and you don't have to invest a lot of effort to achieve that. So I think I think the future is bright.
Looks promising, if I can put it that way. Okay, Alex. So once again, thank you very much. Thank you also for things you've done so far for the community in Poland, because like I mentioned, it all started with by exchanging the emails between us, and here we are, volume number 2. So once again, thank you for your session. Thank you for answering the questions, and I appreciate that we can meet in person, but virtually, if you know what I mean.
Thank you,
And
Carol, and thank you everyone who attended. Feel free to connect on Twitter or LinkedIn. If you have questions or projects or things you want to share, I'm always happy.
sure, will do. Thank you very much.